accused Scotland Yard of two-tier policing after the Metropolitan Police has announced in this past 20 minutes vehicle restrictions for farmers attending a protest outside Parliament.
Listen, here's a thought for you. What if the next time we have a food shortage, it's not because of a drought, a flood, or some pandemic supply chain collapse? What if the shelves go bare because the very people who feed you decided they'd had enough and brought a tank to Parliament? You heard that right. Not a negotiation, not a peaceful march with clever signs. I'm talking about a full-scale, coordinated siege where the government's biggest fear wasn't a terrorist cell, but the guy who harvests their breakfast cereal. When you push the rural working class so far that they swap their plough for a battering ram, you fundamentally misunderstood who actually holds the power in a country. You are about to see how the capital was brought to its knees in 10 minutes flat, and it all started with a simple lie on a spreadsheet. The operation didn't begin like a protest, it began with military precision. Before the city had even poured its first cup of coffee, 5 separate columns of heavy agricultural machinery had already breached the capital's perimeter. This wasn't a local demonstration, this was a planned, hostile takeover. By 8:30 a.m., the arteries leading into London were catastrophically severed. Highways that funnel millions of commuters daily were instantly blocked by tractors, each one a ton of immovable steel. Then came the unthinkable. At 8:54, the Blockade line wasn't just holding, it was advancing, shattering police perimeters and spilling into Westminster itself. The official report says breach. What it should say is e-conquest. The real terror started at 9:15, as witnesses spotted something truly apocalyptic, over a dozen vintage tanks rumbling through the streets, rolling in defiant formation alongside the massive John Deeres. Within minutes, the first confirmed act of operational chaos, a police vehicle was reportedly crushed by one of the Allied armor units. Police refused to confirm it, but the farmers didn't need a press release. The message was already delivered, this was the declaration of war. The reason for this unprecedented aggression doesn't live on a battlefield, it lives in a bureaucratic ledger. This isn't just about money, it's about cultural erasure disguised as fiscal reform. The protesters were reacting to a catastrophic change to the agricultural property relief tax rules. Let's break down the reality. The government's cabinet looks at a farm and sees a £1 million asset, something ripe for taxation. The farmer, however, looks at that very same land and sees a workplace that typically generates less than £30,000 in annual profit. The new mandate? A crippling 20% levy on assets over £1 million. This is not a tax on the elite's hidden offshore wealth, it's a tax on the very existence of the working farm. When the head of the family passes away, their children face an immediate inheritance bill of £500,000. There is no cash reserve on a working farm to pay that. The only viable option is to liquidate the fields, sell the land, and end centuries of family tradition. They are furious that the very assets which feed the nation are being stripped away to plug budgetary holes caused by surging welfare expenditure and accommodation costs, effectively liquidating the countryside to buy the next election with cheap political promises. The protesters weren't asking for handouts or subsidies, they were demanding the simple right to pass their life's work to the next generation without the state inflicting a fatal cut. As they parked their tractors outside the corridors of power, their message was a chilling ultimatum: kill the tax, or we kill the country's agriculture. By 9:30 a.m., every single entry and exit point to the government quarter was systematically sealed off. The agricultural fleet had transformed into an iron curtain, turning Westminster into an isolated island. Analysts were already estimating the financial damage at a staggering £82 million and climbing with every passing hour. Yet, the government, under Starmer, remained utterly frozen, paralyzed by an arrogance born of spreadsheets. They had dismissed the farmers as wealthy landholders, believing they would simply absorb the cost of the tax and quietly declare bankruptcy. This fatal miscalculation failed to account for one fundamental reality: logistics trumps law. The government's worst-case scenario had already materialized. The city's critical supply chain, the very lifeline of a metropolis, was seizing up. Warehouses and distribution hubs, never designed to feed a city besieged by thousands of tons of steel, could not get products in or out. Supermarket chiefs began issuing grim warnings: London's food reserves would last a maximum of 2 to 3 days. The stalemate grew exponentially more dangerous by evening. The thousands the media had previously dismissed as fringe far-right elements and enraged truckers began flooding onto the streets, joining the agricultural columns and the rogue tanks. This volatile combination became a nuclear mixture of political grievance and raw physical power. The M25 highway footage confirmed the scale of the mobilization, resembling a military movement more than a civilian protest. The same heavy machinery used to harvest crops was now being used as an impregnable barricade. Inside the command rooms, panic was setting in. Multiple anonymous officers revealed the terrifying breakdown of protocol. There is no official procedure for stopping a vintage tank driven by a desperate farmer. They didn't lack manpower, they lacked the necessary physics to move 10 tons of steel with a baton or a riot shield. The Home Office's directive was one of impotent paralysis: maintain public order without engaging heavy machinery. This was not a plan, it was a surrender disguised as sterile protocol. A desperate radio message crackled from South London: Sector 15 is lost. We just can't stop them, followed by an urgent request for military equipment. The defiant protesters began firing fireworks directly at the thin police lines. The crisis deepened as allied groups escalated their involvement. Truck drivers issued a stark threat to repeat the fuel crisis of 2000. If the tractors locked down the government district while the truckers drained the petrol stations nationwide, the economy would face an immediate, systemic collapse. Starmer's cabinet was caught between the disastrous consequences of the siege and their refusal to pivot on a tax policy they were too arrogant to admit was wrong. They failed to understand that when you take everything from a man, he has nothing left to lose but his chains. Tonight, Britain wasn't just being governed, it was being meticulously, methodically, and completely besieged until it starved. The tragic irony is inescapable. The government, obsessed with closing a tax loophole on a multi-generational business, has managed to accelerate the very cultural and environmental crises they claim to oppose. By bankrupting local producers, they are now forcing supermarkets into a greater reliance on carbon-heavy imports flown in from thousands of miles away. They traded food security for an accountant's moral posture. The state is actively subsidizing the crisis that is draining its treasury while simultaneously bankrupting the local producers who sustain it. Tonight wasn't just a gridlock, it was a societal reckoning. The government's response, slashing tires on farmers' trailers while treating climate activists with kid gloves, only cemented the public's feeling of betrayal and the crippling double standard at play. Every department, from DARE to the Treasury, had 5 separate impact studies warning of mass insolvency and strategic vulnerability, yet Starmer arrogantly dismissed the risk, convinced the farmers would simply absorb the cost. He was wrong. The defiance echoing through Whitehall is a direct consequence of a chancellor who refused to listen. The panic is not just in the markets, it's in the households that now face bare shelves. Global investment firms are already circling, checkbooks ready, waiting to buy up distressed British soil for pennies on the pound once the forced insolvencies begin. Starmer isn't saving the economy, he is putting the English countryside up for foreign auction. The message from the fields is no longer a warning, it is a final, terrifying promise. When the engines roared on the M25, the countryside wasn't asking for permission, it was declaring war on a system that refused to feed itself.